Everything on Cake News at 10. Welcome to This Week in Kansas with your host, Tim Brown.
Hello and welcome to This Week in Kansas. Thank you for being with us this morning. Governor Sam Brownback has used his executive authority this week to cut $44 million in funding from schools. The governor took the action after another drop in tax revenue for the state. Professors won't be able to criticize the governor and other state officials in letters to the editor while using their official titles. That will be the case if a new bill passes. Nobody is admitting to being the source of that bill, though. We have these stories and a whole bunch more. Let's get started with the budget. I can't even, the second one, it just caused me to chuckle. I can't even help but laugh at that one, but we'll talk about it later in the show because it's entertaining at best, I suppose. Let's talk about the budget. We've had a kind of a crazy week this week with budget issues, and at the date of the taping of the show, which is Thursday, the governor had actually issued an executive order to cut a pretty significant chunk of money out of both K-12 and higher education, about $44 million. And I got to admit, I was a little surprised by this move. I think we saw the Senate had a budget bill, but it was even coming up short with this shortfall.
Right. Well, I mean, most realistically,
this may be the only time you've ever been
taken aback.
Got to admit.
At the most basic level, the most realistic level, Sam Brownback doesn't, I mean, unless he runs for president or there's some conspiracy about him getting to the Senate again, he doesn't have another election. Yeah. Not to say that he's going to go and just be completely ideological, although that's probably most of what he's done. We shouldn't be surprised. We knew that there was a shortfall. We knew that there was going to have to be cuts if they weren't going to consider additional taxes or slowing down or stopping whatever the future tax breaks are going to be. Is there maybe some surprise that he chose to cut that out of education? I don't think so, since Ty Masterson and the work in his state Senate committee has been to either redo the funding formula or to not cut education, but slow the growth in education spending. So, I mean, yes, it's every week now that we are into the throes of the legislative session. Is this making for good political stuff, and that's a terribly unacademic word, to analyze, but to just start us off, who's surprised? Are you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised. I mean, look, okay, so you got this bill that's passed the House, and then it passed the Senate today, and the governor is going to sign it, and so it'll almost take care of the immediate $344 million shortfall. But of course, you got $600 million of shortfalls that are still waiting with the next fiscal year. You've got all sorts of things that are piling up and piling up. He made it very clear for a long time that he's dissatisfied with the fact that the state Supreme Court had, in his words, forced them to, provide, unnecessary increases in education funding. He loves to cherry pick little examples like the fact that a high school made a wise capital investment and spent $50,000 on a grand piano to help their music students for the next 20 or 30 years. Uses that as a way of saying, look, they're awash in money. They've got hundreds of millions of dollars in reserves, as if he doesn't understand, the whole principle of savings, capital interest, endowments, and so forth. I think we should be grateful that he only took out $44 million with the stroke of a pen. He could have done a lot worse.
Right. Michael Smith joins us from Memorial State University. I hesitate to even use your name, but we'll get to that later in the show. I am going to call you that for right now, though, whether you like it or not. What do you think about this? The governor's executive order, $44 million, $44.5 million, I guess, to be accurate. But this is the governor who was, again, in his reelection ads. I saw a bunch of them. Said how he was bolstering education.
Well, he did. The official line, I'm sure you all have heard it, is that the state sales tax collections were slow over the Christmas holidays. But there is a different interpretation. It's the one that I believe, and I've written about it in a newspaper column that I may or may not write, and talked about it on this show and so forth. And that is that this idea, again called dynamic scoring or the Laffer curve, curve that if you cut taxes, you'll have so much economic growth that the tax cuts will pay for themselves, is not borne out all that well by the evidence. And I think Kansas is now becoming the evidence. We are an international experiment in whether or not this theory that tax cuts produce enough economic growth to pay for themselves works. Now, certainly if you have exorbitantly high taxes, and there are some places that do, then yeah, that might work. But I don't think that's where we were in Kansas. I think what we're seeing, my own interpretation, my own belief, is the failure of this dynamic scoring or Laffer curve theory that tax cuts pay for themselves with economic growth.
You know, we've actually had people on this show that have said, hey, we're starving the beast. Politicians say that. They love to use that terminology. Maybe they are.
And the beast is things in communities. One of the popular stereotypes is that all this money goes to bureaucrats and administrators in offices that work in cubicles or offices with mahogany desks. Dave Trobert of the Kansas Policy Institute was talking about that before the legislature just this week. The key is administration. If we cut spending on administration, he suggests privatizing it. But the problem with that is that the definition of administrators in Kansas schools is rather broad. So it would include the people that serve the school lunch. It would include the security guards. It would include a lot of staff that are not paper pushers who work in some back office. When we're talking about cutting those administrators, if that's our plan, it would also include, by the way, support staff and school counselors, which is a big deal in special education especially, but really for all kids, then it's not quite so easy to cut.
Yeah. The point that Michael makes about special education is particularly important. So like, you know, this bill that has made it through the legislature in which the governor is almost certainly going to sign, I mean, among other things, it comes up with $12 million in savings that's earmarked for, you know, early childhood education. This is supposed to be a dedicated fund that was provided out of the tobacco settlement. They're using that money in order to offset the revenue shortfall that we have, that is the creation of income tax cuts. You know, taking over $150 million out of the transportation fund. You can talk about streamlining, you can talk about cutting administration, but ultimately what that means is that there are roads that aren't going to receive the level of maintenance that we expect them to receive in a state where a lot of people have to drive a lot of places frequently. I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road, pun intended. This is what governments spend their money on. And if you are convinced that the way to grow the Kansas economy is to slash our revenue, and you're forced to actually dig into the sort of expenses that states have, that's going to hurt services that are provided to children, services that are provided to drivers on Kansas's roads, and many other things that, you know, traditionally have been protected under state budgets, but aren't really anymore.
All right, guys, I do need to take a commercial break. When we come back, we're going to continue our discussion on this budget challenge, big challenge, and we'll be back in 2 minutes.
Jabara's Home Improvement opened in 1970 to save you money. We opened Jabara's Carpet Outlet 15 years later in 1985 because our customers loved our carpet prices and quality but wanted more choices. That's 30 years of the biggest selection, 30 years of the best prices, and 30 years of quality service. The Jabara's way. We're not a box store or a chain store. We're your hometown flooring superstore. Celebrating 30 years. Jabara's Carpet Outlet.
About to buy flooring from a carpet store? Stop! You've got to see The Floor Project, the first truly unique flooring store in Wichita, featuring wide, bright aisles displaying only the latest, most popular flooring styles, plus huge samples you can take home at no charge. During our President's Day sale, save up to 17% on every in-stock floor. But wait, shop now and we'll double your savings with an additional 10% off President's Day bonus. The Floor Project, twice the savings during our President's Day sale.
Gin Blossoms, live Friday, February 27th at the Orpheum. A benefit to fight cancer, supporting the Dragon Master Foundation. Tickets on sale now at Select-A-Seat.
It was just so easy to work with people from Kitchen Tune-Up. I thought it was beautiful. I thought Kitchen Tune-Up did an awesome job. And what I liked about it was on budget, and obviously it's beautiful.
Want more fresh off the boat? Well, you don't have to wait very long.
I have to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, go. Fresh Off the Boat premieres on its regular night and time, Tuesday at 7 Central on ABC.
Can I do it?
Oh, she fell. She fell. I did not touch her.
Dr. Oz is suiting up.
Why is the Rachel doing this?
Showing you the startling effects of drinking too much. Next, Rachel.
Monday at 9 on Cakeland. For up-to-the-minute news and weather, stay connected to Cake News with Facebook, Twitter, and Cake.com. Always tracking, always alerting, always protecting. Cake News.
Welcome back. We're talking about the budget, some of the challenges. And Roddy, you said something to me during the break that it's interesting, and I understand the statement. We were talking about regressive taxes during the break because one of the things about Governor Brownback, when Mark Parkinson was still governor, we had that 1 cent roughly sales tax increase that was just a stopgap thing that was supposed to sunset. Part of it did sunset, I believe. The governor asked for the rest of it to be kept in place, and I think it's still in place,
right,
if I'm not mistaken. Then we have the governor's plan to increase taxes on booze and cigarettes, and people call them sin taxes. Bob Weeks gets on me every time I call them sin taxes, so I will call it, he calls it vice taxes. Vice taxes. Okay. And because Bob doesn't like the government telling us whether we're sinners or not,
exactly,
which I kind of agree with, actually. Bob, it's a good point. And you mentioned to me that, well, gosh, say what you said, because
it's ideological, and there's plenty of debate, discussion over which one's truly regressive. Governor Brownback and the conservatives who are in vast control of our state government right now would rather people be taxed on their choices versus their income. And there's deep philosophical roots in regards to that. Why that's important in conjunction with what Michael was saying earlier is these are the same people that also truly believe in that the states are laboratories of democracy. And so it's their right, it's their duty to conduct these experiments, although it's interesting that Brownback tried to, walk back from that word when he was running for re-election.
Didn't like experiment, then he said it was actually the legislature.
Right. But they think that this is something they should do, and Michael's right and wrong. There's evidence that supply side economics works. When federal taxes were cut in '81 and '83 and in 2001 and 2003, we saw economic improvements. We saw federal revenues going into place. The difference is the federal government can deficit spend in the meantime until the effects of those tax cuts take place. We can't do that in Kansas, and so you are going to have to cut in order to balance the budgets.
And these are very dramatic cuts, too. A couple of points, and,
sure,
and I know we'll get on with this, Russell. I know you've got some thoughts as well. When you talk about your choice of whether to be taxed or not based on sales taxes or sin taxes, whatever you call them, I understand what you're saying, but I guess my point on that is, and I think this is why they truly are regressive taxes, they do hit lower income people harder because, sure, if I'm making $10 million a year and I decide I'm going to go out and buy a pack of cigarettes, I'm paying the exact same tax rate that the guy that's making $10 an hour is paying. And if I'm smoke as much as he does, we're paying the same taxes. How is that fair?
Talk about it a little bit differently, though. Because I am of the opinion that something like a national sales tax is preferable to an income tax. But the difference is the rational form of that legislation makes it so that the people in the lowest income brackets would not see a tax on basic necessities like food, clothes. We're talking about the kinds of things that, that person making $10 million a year, they're buying yachts and they're buying lots of cars and they have big houses and they're buying expensive clothes. And the person who's not doing that, they can have a choice. Now again, to be fair, it depends on how you write the legislation. I mean, is it State Senator O'Donnell and Aletha Faust-Goudreau
working on
have legislation to take the sales tax off of food.
Right.
So you can write a legislation that still is philosophically primered off of, do you tax income, do you tax choices, so that that it doesn't hit people the lowest, the hardest. It just depends on what kind of work you want to do politically and at the legislative level.
Russell, surely you have an opinion.
Yeah, well, okay, I have a lot of opinions, but the one thing that I would add in connection with all this is that, you talk about the states being laboratories of democracy. It's true. Not all states are created equal. And when you attempt to create an experiment within a particular state, you have to take into consideration the actual demographic and economic and constitutional limitations of that state. You've already mentioned one of those. For instance, the national government can deficit spend, whereas Kansas, constitutionally at least, though they find ways around that, are not able to deficit spend. Other things, you're looking at a state that doesn't have a robust tourist economy and simply probably can never have one. You're looking at a state that has population issues that states like Texas or California or New York don't have. But the national government can make use of those sorts of things. There's issues of scale that come into play that complicate this philosophical discussion even more so than, I think is within range of our state legislature to deal with. If they see themselves as a bunch of philosophical kings pursuing, some possible route to a truly alternative economy, they have to recognize that their playing field just might not be ideal for doing it.
Yeah. Let's bring in our guest, who may or may not be Michael Smith from Emporia State University, to get him to jump in on this as well. Michael, maybe?
A couple of things. Although I would not support a national sales tax, I do totally agree with Rodney's point that taking that sales tax off groceries does take a lot of the sting out. And Kansas, to its credit, does exempt medicine, at least prescription meds, not over the counter, from sales taxes, which some states don't. Missouri doesn't. But Kansas is kind of an outlier in not exempting groceries. And because lower income people have to spend, they live paycheck to paycheck, they have to spend the whole paycheck on necessities. If all those are subject to taxation like groceries, then they're paying taxes on all their income, whereas upper income people have the privilege of being able to put some money away in investments. That's not subject to sales tax. So that's what that's all about. My other point is that, again, I've got to agree with Rodney that there are situations where the Laffer curve idea would work. And I would say that those are situations where you have extraordinarily high tax rates. So President Kennedy, for example, signed a tax cut. Tax rates were over 70%, the marginal top tax rate for the federal income taxes back then. They got up over 90% in the Eisenhower administration. When you cut that tax rate from 90% to 70%, sure, you're going to have enough economic growth even to pay for the tax cut. But let's not forget that that's not what the tax rates were in Kansas to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Michael. I really do.
And that tax, the rates that were cut happened at the same time that the payroll tax at the federal level went back up from whatever it was, 7.5, was it 6, and it went back up to 8 or whatever it was. So when Kansans saw that reduction federally, they saw it go back up. So it really was a wash, which is probably also why we haven't seen this shot of adrenaline that they were hoping for.
Well, to be honest, the shot of adrenaline that the governor was hoping for was pretty significant. I mean, it would have to be, and we had somebody on the show that gave the figures at one point as far as the influx of jobs and people and money was, it was tremendous. Right. And honestly, I think just even under the best case scenarios, that would have been pie in the sky. I really do. And right.
And of course, all of this was happening at the time that we're in the wake of the financial meltdown of 2008. We have huge transformations going on in the American economy at that time. Wisdom and prudence would have dictated that this is not a good time to experiment, even if you genuinely believe in the validity of the experiment. But they took the political opportunity that came, and they sold it hard to those who believed in it.
Right. And we're going to bring this, because we've got lots of other stuff to talk about, so we'll bring this segment to a close, but I'm going to kind of end it with where I started. We saw that tax increase that was started by Governor Parkinson that was supposed to sunset. At least part of it still exists. We've seen the asks for the keep calling them sin taxes, but
Vice.
the vice taxes to happen. We see the borrowing from the highway fund. It just appears to me, you know, we're talking about how we're going to cut taxes. It just appears to me to be a big shell game. And I'm not saying Governor Brownback is the only governor that's ever been guilty of this.
Right.
Other governors have done this. Democratic governors have done this as well. And maybe that's just what politics is all about.
It's done on the federal level too.
Yeah.
So.
No, I certainly don't disagree with that, particularly at the federal level. So anyway, let's we'll get off our soapboxes. Then we'll get right back on them here in the next segment. We'll take a break. We'll let our ankles rest. Then we'll climb back up. We'll be back.
Make cleanup a breeze with help from Rubbermaid and Menards. Dispose of your trash in this 32-gallon heavy-duty Brute trash can. It has a lid and is only $24.99. This 35-quart wave break mop bucket reduces splashing for a safer environment and cleaner floors. Just $49. Clean your way with Libman. Get this 24-inch floor squeegee with handle or this 100% cotton yarn mop with handle. Your choice, just $9.99 each.
Save big money at Menards.
Last year, a Cake News I-Team investigation exposed evidence of what the state called abuse and neglect at a Kansas nursing home.
If that was my grandma, it would just tear me up.
Monday night at 10, we uncover the changes being made to all nursing homes across the state because of our investigation and what happened to the people in this video. Kansas nursing homes after the nightmare. Monday night at 10.
Your website is a direct reflection of your business. Create a dynamic and responsive website with the power of LocalX. LocalX is a full-service, national quality-level digital agency dedicated to local business. Together, we will maximize the growth of your organization in your community. Contact a local expert and get started today. LocalX, your local digital marketing experts. Go online at localxmarketing.com.
In Kansas, weather conditions can change quickly, from clear to severe. When a storm is on the horizon, when the clock is ticking, you need time. Cake First Alert is there, tracking, alerting, protecting.
Showing you what's happening now, preparing you for what's coming next.
Keeping you hours, even days ahead of the storm, giving you the time you need. Jay Prater on the Cake First Alert team. Always tracking, always alerting, always protecting.
And welcome back. During this break, we're going to talk about possibly one of the dumbest pieces of legislation I've seen in recent history, and you know my feeling on this one. We're going to start with the person who may or may not be Michael Smith from Macquarie State University, because he's actually the only one of us here, I think, in trouble potentially for appearing on the show. Although this isn't a newspaper, so maybe you're okay the way this bill is written. Michael, fill us in on this ridiculous piece of legislation, please.
Wow, Tim, I've never heard you editorialize like that before. That's
a couple of times.
But boy, when you hit that wall. But okay. First of all, I should mention that this show was mentioned by some reporters who asked me about this, wondering specifically why the bill doesn't cover television appearances, and they specifically mentioned this show.
Well, I'm glad. My feelings were actually hurt just a bit by Representative
that you were left
Peck,
out.
if he wrote this bill, but we don't know if he did.
That's why you dislike the legislation so much.
That's right.
But
you know me, don't you?
One possible, better and better each time. The one possible contributor to this, I did write a column about a month ago. It was critical of the Kansas Policy Institute. I had some questions about how they run their budget estimates because they tend to be off. A good example being that they ran a bunch of different budget scenarios, and right now where we are, now this does not count the announcements today, but right now where we are on the state budget falls closest to their worst case scenario, and they got the estimates pretty close to the state's estimates for 2016. We're talking fiscal years, of course, here, which start in July. They got them right for 2016, 2015, 2016, and then they shoot way up over the state's estimates for 2018. I believe, and I don't see where they came up with that, and I speculated that maybe they used something very popular with conservative groups called dynamic scoring, where you count the likely impact of tax cuts on economic growth as huge, and that they're maybe producing inaccurate estimates. They actually wrote an editorial denouncing me, published it in the Hayes Daily News. They've got clout. Dave Traubert, who is the face of the Kansas Policy Institute, he was up testifying in Topeka today, or not today, but this week about the budget. And we've written some other columns that have been critical of the governor and the Secretary of State. We have some concerns, but there is this whole idea about the marketplace of ideas. If you think we're wrong, I wish you'd just debate it and let's talk about it. This is a little silly. And by the way, we wouldn't stop writing the columns.
Well, I know you wouldn't, but you just wouldn't put your names
on
them.
Is that a threat,
titles, I suppose. So anyway, this is to kind of describe this. What the bill is, and this is kind of silly on so many levels because, first of all, we don't really know who wrote this thing. Right. Virgil Peck was said to have sponsored it. He denied it at first, but then when confronted by, I guess somebody, who was it, Steve Hubert, said that he had written it. Then he said, well, I may have written it, but I don't remember. Seems kind of odd.
It's remarkable the amount of defensiveness that I see coming out of the legislature, or at least out of the mouths of some of these individual legislators, when it comes to some of these more, shall we say, oddball bills that they propose. I mean, there is a broader conversation that's taking place in Kansas right now, obviously, that has a lot to do with public discussion and First Amendment rights and transparency and accountability and whatnot. And some of it is pretty serious, but this is just weird. This is a bill that suggests that a very particular class of people, namely academics employed in Regency schools, should not be allowed to cite the fact that they are employees of these universities when they, act as pundits, when they act as, public intellectuals, which is one of the primary functions of a faculty in the first place. I mean, how odd. Why are you focusing on this group of people as opposed to the hundreds of other people coming from dozens of different organizations who also act as public intellectuals, who also share their expertise? I mean, obviously there's a bit of an ideological agenda here, and probably underneath that, just a bunch of personal pique. I don't know what you can say much more about it than that.
Well, and I'm guessing, but the same amount of disdain that some people have ideologically against unions and specifically public employee unions might. I'm probably giving them way too much credit here by describing this. The fact that Michael may or may not be paid by the taxpayers, but yet he is espousing an opinion that students may or may not be influenced by. I mean, there's a lot of people in this world who probably have some opinion around that. But, I teach drama, so let's pantomime here something. Let's go down the checklist. What should we be focusing on right now? The budget, the economy, people moving out of Kansas, this question over school finance, what schools just in general. I mean, there's a checklist of easily a half dozen things that should be taking all of our focus. And I know there's plenty out there that will be, well, they can do, we have all the committees, they can do all that stuff. You know what? Sure. But really? Really? You're going to go after people who have devoted, I mean, this is not, maybe I'm an elitist, we're not pulling in somebody off the street to espouse an opinion. The people, like someone who might be named Michael Smith, has gone to school, has devoted a significant amount of his life to study and research and articulate an opinion, yes, but certainly an opinion that might be different than Virgil Peck's or somebody's. Yeah. But it's not that it's just completely like this bill and coming from Mars.
Well, and part of the big problem I have, there are many issues that I have with this bill. I mean, I think it stifles free speech, on and on and on. I think it stifles debate. Yeah, you may not agree with, and see, that's what, and that's what this show is about. I have people on this show all the time that I may not agree with. Rodney, I may not agree with you, but that's the beauty of having you on the show. I always do. Well, not always, but sometimes I do. But that's the beauty of having you on the show, because there is the debate back and forth between the guests, and sometimes, and we'll have some letters later on in the show that people don't think we do a very good job of this, but sometimes we don't balance the show as well as I would like to, but the next week I always try to make up for it.
Right.
That is the honest to goodness truth. And that's what this is about, and that's what it should be about. You don't necessarily agree with the other person's opinion, but you can listen to them, you can debate them, and if you don't agree with them, then you can dig up some facts to show why you disagree with them. Yeah. You know, and I guess it really annoys me because we don't even know who wrote this thing, and nobody will fess up to it. You know, if you're going to submit a bill, if you're going to write a bill and put it in for the legislature, you have the guts to say you did it, for crying out loud. You know, we've got Virgil Peck, who says he may or may not have done it, he doesn't remember. Joe Seward, I believe, from Pretty Prairie, says, this quote in the Topeka Capital Journal, and he was upset that they were getting called to task for this. He says, the thing up here is that everybody wants to pinpoint somebody for something to make a story out of it. No, people don't want to pinpoint you to make a story out of it. They want to know who wrote it. And if you wrote it, have the guts to stand up and say you wrote it. Come on. I mean, that's
it's simple democratic accountability, and I can't help but suspect that, you know, on some meta level, behind this bill and behind the arguments over the Open Records Act and behind this idea that you know, school teachers ought to be penalized for introducing damaging, offensive.
That's our next segment. Don't get too far down that road.
I wonder if on some level what you have is a way too confident political majority that is just fishing for, you know, controversies that they can use to rile up the faithful.
Wedge issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, here they are having responsibility for making actually some rather unpopular decisions. But if they can remind their base that we're here preventing crazy professors spouting off wicked opinions, then they'll be able to continue to count on their funding and support and votes.
Michael, before we go to the person who may or may not be Michael Smith, before we go to break, isn't this the party of less government intrusion and less government regulation, I thought?
Well, that's a good question. I got a quote here from Seward. He said, there's 100 newspaper articles printed bashing people and using the university name, and if I work for John Deere, AT&T, or whatever, if I use my official title to make a comment without approval, they're not going to let me do that. This really speaks, it kind of reminds me to the situation in Wisconsin you may have heard of, with the governor moving and then backing off to strike language from the University of Wisconsin system's 100-year-old commitment to the public good, and replace it with language that their sole mission is technical training. There's just, it's getting to the point in the Republican Party. This has not always been the case. The Republican Party has been very progressive on education in the past, including in this state. But it's getting to the point where there's really just a fundamental misunderstanding of what higher education is. And there's a concept, I know that Rodney knows about this one, I know that Russell does, it's one of the classics, the marketplace of ideas. Mm-hmm. This idea that we promote discussion, we promote debate. You can take any position you want, as long as it's not hate speech, of course, but any position you want, but you have to back it up. You have to defend your point of view. I can't tell you how many students I have that have a totally different political ideology than I do, that have earned good grades because they argued for their ideas, they researched it, they backed it up with data. And the sponsors of this bill are doing none of those things.
All right, guys, let's take another commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about teachers and harmful material. Be back in 2.5 minutes.
Jabara's Home Improvement opened in 1970 to save you money. We opened Jabara's Carpet Outlet 15 years later in 1985 because our customers loved our carpet prices and quality but wanted more choices. That's 30 years of the biggest selection, 30 years of the best prices, and 30 years of quality service. The Jabara's way. We're not a box store or a chain store. We're your hometown flooring superstore. Celebrating 30 years. – Jabara's Carpet Outlet.
The Thunder are returning to action this Friday night, so get your tickets now. Call 755-SEAT and catch the coolest game in town.
Tapping them, activating the speaker, and blocking
I don't know. I think everything is better if you use it on the server side.
I got it. Hey, I wonder who this is, guys. Look, it's my new Wi-Fi modem from Cox. I forgot this was coming today. Wow. Guess I have the fastest internet now.
Whoa.
Let's go install it!
Yeah!
Trust the nerds. Get access to the fastest in-home Wi-Fi from Cox with high-speed internet as low as $19.99 a month, and ask how to get a $200 prepaid card.
Do you want to get your face painted like a pretty butterfly?
No, I'm just not in the mood.
The fair comes to town.
I'm going to win the cake contest, and then there'll be no stopping me.
From what, a beating?
On the next Modern Family.
Monday night at 6:30, only on Cakeland.
You never see it coming, but suddenly, when your life is on the line, the only thing that matters is, will you make it out alive? Now, this week, meet the survivors, ordinary people who made it out of certain death alive, and learn how they did it. Survival Week, this week on Good Morning America.
Hey ladies, couldn't you really use a fun day? You know, shopping, good food, maybe even get the diva treatment, all for a good cause. Get it all at the 10th Annual Shopportunity, an event especially for women. Thursday, April 23rd at Newmarket Square. You can even upgrade to the Diva Club for some extra special treatment. Best of all, Shopportunity benefits people with disabilities through Independent Living Resource Center. Call or visit cake.com to get your advance tickets before they're gone.
Shopportunity, together with these sponsors and Cakeland.
And welcome back. Another bill that is sure to cause some controversy would make it much easier for people to, well, for law enforcement, I guess, to charge and prosecute teachers with distributing harmful material to minors, depending on what happens in a classroom. And this all comes, this is was sponsored by Mary Pilcher Cook, I believe. Mm-hmm. She was one of the people, I think, that was behind this one. And it came out of a situation back about a year ago, a poster in a sex education classroom in Shawnee Mission that several folks objected to. And this is an interesting little piece of legislation here. I kind of wonder what's going to happen with this one.
Hopefully it dies the same quick fate as the one we just talked about. You know, if you're, I mean, we're not even, you need to broach the sex ed topic, but if you're a history teacher or a government teacher, and you're talking about, just pick some Supreme Court cases, and I'm brain fart right now, but the Supreme Court case about a freedom of speech where a guy went into a county courthouse, I think maybe in Texas, doesn't matter where it was, but his shirt had the F word, and it said F, but spelled out, the draft.
Yep.
Well, is that now offensive? When I teach that in my classroom, am I going to be charged? If we talk about Lawrence v. Texas and sodomy laws, am I going to be charged for harming somebody's child because I'm introducing them to potentially offensive material? I mean, this is just nonsense. But again, for some reason, the far right wing in this state feel, and probably maybe nationally, feel the need to constantly come up with some kind of wedge issue for motivation purposes, for fundraising purposes, for whatever. But this is damaging. I mean, what are the implications of this? We're talking about someone potentially being arrested for a crime because of something that every history book probably might be talking about. What does that do to that person's career? We're talking about a career-ending possible charge.
Well, I would argue whoever writes this bill doesn't care.
They
probably would like that.
I really, the more that I think about it, the more I really feel that you know, this is the best way to understand these things. This is a way to generate red meat that can be thrown out to the true believers. You know, you have seen this recently at the University of Virginia. You've seen it, you know, as Michael mentioned, in the University of Wisconsin, all sorts of different ways to gin up arguments about educators, about the ways in which they are not conforming with, you know, somebody's preferred standards of speech, or the way that in which you know, popular sentiment on campuses or among school teachers, you know, can be whipped up into, you know, some sort of enemy. You know, they're brainwashing your children, they're introducing harmful material to your children, they're, you know, spouting off unreasonably on all sorts of things that need to be left to, you know, legislators to work out. I just find it silly. And the most important reason why it's silly is because there are already procedures in place for concerned parents, for legislators, for community organizations to, make use of the marketplace of ideas, as Michael said, to go to principals, to go to superintendents, to go to newspaper editors and say, hey, we need equal time, or hey, this went beyond the pale. And there are procedures by which these complaints can be addressed.
Michael, I want to get your thoughts on this. To me, the very genesis of this whole bill is the best argument against the bill, because that poster that happened, the teacher was disciplined, the poster was taken out, so everything worked. There was attention that was given to it, outrage, it made the news, people were mad, the school district did something about it. So exactly. In my mind, if there truly is a problem here, everything worked.
I think that's very, very well said, Tim. It's hard for me to think of anything to add except just to remind you a little of the history of the sponsor of this. This is Mary Pilcher Cook. This is the legislator that arranged for a live sonogram to be performed in a committee room in the state capitol building a while back, previous session. She is very much on the edge. She's, I think, our modern-day successor to Senator Kay O'Connor, who you may remember, the one that said women wouldn't need to.
No, we may have lost Michael, it looks like, right there. We'll end the segment, but again, this part of the distressing thing to me about this is the Republican Party. This is the party that promises us less government intrusion, less government meddling, and here we are, there's more.
But it's not the party of Bill Buckley or Barry Goldwater or probably even Ronald Reagan. No. And Ronald Reagan certainly was a social conservative, but not in this new mold in which, there was just a hypocritical inconsistency to their philosophy, which again, it has to just be about ginning up red meat.
And remember that none of those people that you mentioned operated in a political environment where they had such a complete majority,
right?
That they can speak to. I mean, they have a level of confidence in their ability to, generate issues as they think they see fit.
Right.
All right. Guys, let's take another commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk about Chris Kobach and the suspended voter list. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Gin Blossoms, live Friday, February 27th at the Orpheum. A benefit to fight cancer, supporting the Dragon Master Foundation. Tickets on sale now at Select-A-Seat.
When we first worked with Kitchen Tune-Up, it was at another residence. They met our deadline, our timelines, choices that they had, and the selections that they gave us were very much to our liking. Kitchen Tune-Up was awesome.
Cake News, tracking the big stories.
A second measles case now confirmed.
A person is dead from whooping cough.
Alerting you to breaking news and weather.
2 people shot.
Pow, pow, pow. That sounds real close.
Nothing to an inch of snow, and that includes some snowflakes in Wichita. I just don't think they're going to stack up.
Protecting you and your family.
Police searching for a man who reportedly exposed himself to 11 and 13-year-old girls.
This person is out there.
Always tracking, always alerting, always protecting. Cake News.
Hey ladies, couldn't you really use a fun day? Shopping, good food, maybe even get the diva treatment, all for a good cause. Get it all at the 10th Annual Shopportunity, an event especially for women, Thursday, April 23rd at Newmarket Square. You can even upgrade to the Diva Club for some extra special treatment. Best of all, Shopportunity benefits people with disabilities through Independent Living Resource Center. Call or visit cake.com to get your advance tickets before they're gone.
Shopportunity, together with these sponsors and Cakeland. Cakeland Television airs educational programming for children, which is identified on the screen with EI followed by the targeted age group. Each quarter, the children's programming broadcast by Cakeland Television is documented in a filing submitted to the FCC. This filing can be found in the station's public inspection file, available on the FCC's website at fcc.gov. If you would like to comment on or make suggestions about this programming, please contact the station.
And welcome back. There was an article recently in the news about Chris Kobach and the suspended voter list. And basically, I think the gist of it, Mike, we're going to start with you on this one because you brought this to my attention. But I think the gist of this whole thing was that I believe around between 30 and 40% of the people on the suspended voter list had issues. And I'm not sure exactly what the issues were, but we're going to let you take it from here.
I'm not sure what they are either. I have requested from the Secretary of State's office the data and the methods used to analyze it because we political scientists have the tools to reanalyze it and see what's going on. I will say that many of the other studies, and I'm sorry I can't talk about this study, I know that'd be much better, but I don't have the data, at least I don't have it yet. Many of the other studies claiming similar findings have been really questionable. There are a number of issues that we need to watch out for with this. One is called the birthday problem. If you have hundreds of thousands of voters on a list, even tens of thousands, some of them have common names like me, you are going to have more than one voter with the same name and the same birthday. Now, conventional wisdom would say if you have two voters with the same name, just check the birthday. But that's not foolproof. There's another Michael Smith out there that was also born on the same day I was, more than one, especially with a common name. Another problem is that sometimes people are thought to have died and still be on the voting rolls. The problem with that is that sometimes people die after elections. So they cast legitimate, bona fide ballots, and then they die afterwards. Sometimes people are thought to have fake addresses because there are a whole bunch of people registered from the same street address. Problem, that can be an apartment or some sort of an institutional building. And some apartments don't even use apartment numbers on there. They just have a centralized mail system. And so there are just a number of different issues here that this allegation that people are registered twice or that people don't live at the address they're claiming really need to be scrutinized. And I can't wait to get the data from the Secretary of State's office because that's just what we're going to do.
You know, I also find it curious, guys, we hear Chris Kobach again asking for the ability to prosecute voter fraud cases, which is a curious thing, and we saw this, I think it was last session when he was talking about, you know, we have the local district attorneys that are currently on the hook to do that. That's their job, and for some reason the perception is that they aren't doing that job.
Yeah, but can we just, you know, be realistic about Chris Kobach's mentality? I mean, this is a guy that wants to bring back straight line or straight party line ticket voting on ballots. This is a guy that doesn't want people to be able to take their name off of a ballot unless they die. So they can't take their name off a ballot if they decide for whatever reason they don't want to run anymore, even though there are statutory requirements for that regardless. I just can't decide willy-nilly to take my name off. But clearly he has an antipathy towards the democratic process. Again, the party that's supposed to be of limited government, who are supposed to trust the people, he just really doesn't trust the people or the process. Not that there might have been 7 instances of voter fraud in the last 30 years in Kansas, but again, was that sufficient to require now having tens of thousands of people who potentially can't vote in Kansas because 7 people voted illegally in 30 years.
Russell?
The only thing I have to add to that is that I want to see Michael's treatment of the data as well. I have given a couple of presentations over the last month with different organizations that want to have a better understanding of what happened in the elections. And these presentations led me to have conversations with some really smart, really involved people. And these are not crackpots. These are people that are serious students of the process, and they take a look at the suspension voter list. They took a look at the number of turnout, the raw number of voters that cast ballots, but they also take a look at what happened to advance ballots. They take a look at the percentages of turnout amongst Hispanic population, amongst low-income populations. And let's just say they are just very troubled and in fact suspicious of this whole process. And as Rodney points out, the public comments of our Secretary of State do not exactly engender confidence in the whole system.
To add to that, we've talked about municipal elections on this program before. There was a quote that came out this week, I believe, and I can't remember what lawmaker it was from. I wish I would have printed that one out and brought it with me, but the comment was we don't want to part of the reason why we're doing this is we don't want teachers unions to have such a large say in these municipal elections because so few voters turn out. And I thought that was a curious comment because it was almost in effect that lawmaker admitting that they want to stack the deck against. I guess it depends on how you look at it.
Right.
That lawmaker would say the deck is stacked against, and
well, we can go
he's just
back.
trying to level the playing field.
We can go back to Kobach again, who is on record in a radio show talking about how, you know, there are certain demographics, like, you know, in his view, low-income Hispanics, that are easily swayed by socialist teachings. And so therefore, those of us who don't like socialism actually shouldn't be overly enthusiastic to help these people, you know, register and vote. I mean, that's pretty plain right there. That, you know, you have. It's not so much that you dislike the process. You like the process so long as it involves the right sort of people.
Sure.
Yeah. And it's so long as it works for you.
And it produces the right outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's take another commercial break. When we come back, we've got some letters to This Week in Kansas. Maybe you'll enjoy them. Stick around.
My tax returns are here.
All right, I'll take those. Just sign here, here, and here. And good luck with that car.
Folks, don't let some clown take your money. At the largest Chevrolet Ford dealer in Kansas, we want you to get the car that you want to drive, and you can hold on to your refund.
No matter what your credit is, we've got the inventory and finance options to get you a newer or even a brand new vehicle, and you keep your hard-earned money.
I believe these belong to you, miss.
Your money goes further with us. Lubers, the friendly way to buy.
We expose the scams.
Guess what? That check, it's going to bounce.
We hold the cheaters accountable.
We won't tolerate people here that don't want to obey the rules.
We follow the turns of every story.
Wherever smart meters are used, they have problems.
To uncover the secrets just beneath the surface.
A huge reason for it going up is greed.
And make the wrongs right.
To a recommendation that the administrator's license be suspended or revoked.
The Kick News I-Team. Always tracking, always alerting, always protecting.
Fresh Off the Boat is this year's #1 new comedy.
Yes!
It's being called Damn Funny, the best comedy of the new season.
I miss my friends. We had such pleasant talks.
And ABC Tuesday, it's all new.
These Skittles are compliments of that gentleman over there.
Go on, girl. Taste the rainbow.
Fresh Off the Boat.
What happened to your leg?
Hey, girl.
Stop acting weird. Go to the bathroom. We're leaving soon.
All new Tuesday, 8/7 Central on ABC.
Last year, a Cake News I-Team investigation exposed evidence of what the state called abuse and neglect at a Kansas nursing home.
If that was my grandma, it would just tear me up.
Monday night at 10, we uncover the changes being made to all nursing homes across the state because of our investigation and what happened to the people in this video. Kansas nursing homes after the nightmare. Monday night at 10.
And welcome back. It looks like lawmakers will not be passing any kind of a law to close the open, it's basically a loophole in the Open Records Act. Right. If you send an email from a government, state email address, that is something that can be looked at basically by the people of the state of Kansas. If you send it from your private email address, even if it is state business to other state employees, currently you can't. And there was an effort to close that loophole. Lawmakers said no.
Well, and they said no because of the process. And it's just like, really? You're angry because it didn't go through the committee process? Nobody, even if it's not in the technical specificity of the law, it certainly breaks the spirit of the law as far as wanting open and sunshine on what government is doing. And this legislative session right now, quite frankly, is all about cutting education funding, attacking teachers, and not wanting transparency. Because the other big part of this whole lack of transparency thing is the vast majority of Republicans voting against recording votes. And even if they're just little procedural votes, why do we want the voters to have less information? And they were actually quite clear on this, because they don't want palm cards, they don't want literature, and what somebody said specifically was they don't want something that could be used against them later, which is why they don't want their votes recorded.
Well, look at the thing that we've been joking about, you know, all through the program. Bills that nobody is really willing to fess up to having written.
Right.
You know, it's a lack of seriousness when it comes to accountability.
All right, Michael, a quick comment on that, and we're going to get to letters.
I think that's well said. The email issue is controversial. It's also been an issue with some Coke money at KU and a student that's been asking questions. These are real questions. Where do you draw the line on state business or something that may be related to state business sent over email? But certainly when a lobbyist gets a heads up about the budget that others do not, it raises questions.
Yeah. All right, we're going to read a couple of few emails that we've received recently, and I keep promising to do this on the show, and I apologize that I just haven't gotten around to doing it, so we're going to make up for it tonight. We've got several. We'll start off with the first one from Bob and Val. The Kochs not only have influence on local and national politics, but that influence also brings about control. You have to expect some return on investment. Need I go on? I think you were too soft on them. We watch your show every week and are appreciative of the show. That's from Bob and Val. Thanks for the excellent show and weekly updates from Topeka. The program ranks pretty high in our home, even records on the DVR, which is only saved for the best. Well, that's nice. I find it interesting that each week many of the conversations regarding education do not represent the title of the program. Example, this morning's show spent several, wasted in my opinion, minutes on This Week in Northeast Kansas, charter schools. Please represent the impossibilities of that entire conversation for the rest of Kansas, those far from Topeka and large cities. Where are we to go? Just curious if your guests will have answers for us. Thanks and keep up the great work. That's from Sonia. Then we have another one. Our church was canceled, and this will probably be the first and last time to watch this program totally one-sided. When did journalism promote one side and bash the other? And of course, you don't have any possible helps or solutions to suggest. Be sure to get all the bashing in on Coke. Quit whining. What a joke of a program today with your ridiculous small talk. God is in control, and God bless you, Patricia. Wow, what a show. Karl Marx is very proud today. All three far-left talkers. You only lacked a banner behind you of a hammer and a sickle and a red flag. This is the very reason why I did not vote for Paul Davis. There's no such thing as a conservative Democrat. Sincerely, Ed. Thanks, Ed. And one last one. I enjoy this program every Sunday morning. It's a good show, so well produced, and really explores the issues of the state in an intelligent manner. So I appreciate the choice of panelists, always bringing a different aspect of an issue that gives depth and understanding. It's not a platform for the parties. Much love from here. Thanks for all your work and excellent work, Mary. So thank you for writing into us, and thank you guys for being on the show. If you guys have any questions or comments on this show, please email me. We might read them on the air at thisweekinkansas@cake.com. Hope everybody has a wonderful week.
There are